I never imagined I'd be saying these words aloud. Even now, as I sit here, that same overwhelming feeling washes over me like a relentless tide. I can't shake it. How could I have allowed something like this to happen? How did it escalate to this point? The truth is, I'm ashamed to even talk about it, but it feels like the only way to finally confront the memories that haunt me. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more compelling true confessions like this one. Be sure to stick around until the end and hit the like button to show your support. It's strange how the mind can convince you that what you're doing is right, even when deep down you know it isn't. This was never supposed to happen. What started as a fleeting moment of weakness spiraled into something I couldn't control, leaving me trapped with guilt, confusion, and a harsh reality I couldn't ignore. I tried to push it away, to bury it deep enough that it wouldn't hurt anymore, but no matter how much I tried, the truth refused to be forgotten. Sitting here now, I can finally see how much damage has been done. How could I explain this to anyone? How do you confess to crossing a boundary so unforgivable, one that should never have existed in the first place? I don't know if I'll ever find a way to forgive myself. But maybe sharing this, maybe admitting it out loud, is the first step toward confronting what I've done. When I look back, it's almost easy to convince myself that everything seemed normal at first. It was one of those calm evenings when life's routine feels oddly comforting. My mom had just finished cooking dinner, and the three of us, my mom, Greg, and I, sat down at the table. There was laughter, casual conversation, and the sound of utensils clinking against plates. For a brief moment, it felt like we were just an ordinary family, but if I'm being honest, even then, I could sense the truth. There was a subtle shift in the air between Greg and me. At first, it was easy to dismiss, a fleeting thought or a brief glance, but it was there, undeniable in its quiet persistence. I found myself watching him, noticing how his laughter lit up his face, or how his eyes sparkled in the soft glow of the dining room. I tried not to look too long, brushing aside the strange feeling creeping up my spine. But it wasn't easy. A part of me didn't want to admit that something within me was changing, that the familiar comfort of our family dinners was starting to feel different. What was it? A change I couldn't understand. Was it just me, or was something shifting between us? Something unspoken but impossible to ignore? I wasn't ready to face it. The moment my mom left the house, I felt it. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I knew something had shifted. She was heading off on another business trip, the kind she'd taken countless times before. But this time, it felt different. As though she wasn't just leaving the house, but leaving behind the fragile balance of our family. I stood in the doorway, watching as her car disappeared down the driveway. Suddenly, the house felt quieter, emptier, as a strange stillness settled over me. Now it was just Greg and me. At first, everything seemed normal. Just the usual small talk. The kind that fills the silence when two people aren't sure what to say. I thought I'd feel relieved to have some quiet, but instead, the air felt heavy. Every word between us charged with an unspoken weight. We talked about simple things, dinner plans, our day, but the way we spoke had changed. The distance that had always existed between us was slowly closing. I noticed how his hand brushed mine when we reached for the same mug. How his eyes lingered a fraction too long when we made eye contact. It felt intimate in a way that made my heart race, though I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was different. Something that hadn't been there before. With my mom gone, it was just the two of us. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when it all started. At first, it seemed innocent, just fleeting moments I could brush aside. But now, looking back, I realized those moments weren't as trivial as I had told myself. They stayed with me, replaying in my mind over and over as I tried to make sense of them. It all began one afternoon when Greg walked into the kitchen, as casually as he always did. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. But then, he did something that made me freeze in place. He wasn't wearing a shirt. Time seemed to slow as my eyes unwillingly traced the contours of his back, catching how the light highlighted his skin. I wasn't ready for the wave of unease it sent through me, a reaction far stronger than I wanted to acknowledge. The moment seemed to stretch endlessly, cloaked in a silence I couldn't escape. He didn't appear to notice my hesitation, but I couldn't pull my gaze away. I should have looked somewhere else. I should have said something, but I didn't. Instead, I froze, feeling a warmth rise in my chest as my breath faltered for longer than it should have. It felt as though I had crossed a boundary without even realizing it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. After all, it was just Greg, my mom's boyfriend, someone I'd known for years. But that's the thing. It wasn't nothing. Later that evening, as I stirred a pot on the stove, The silence around me felt more oppressive than usual. The house seemed smaller, as though the walls were pressing in. I wore a light, sheer outfit, something I wouldn't have thought twice about before, but tonight, it felt different. When Greg walked into the kitchen, his eyes met mine. The glance was brief but enough to make my heart skip a beat. There was a shift in the air between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us acknowledged but both silently felt. It was as if everything we had ignored was suddenly laid bare, even though we said nothing. The quiet between us was heavy with unspoken words, a weight that filled the room. I wanted to break it, to speak, but I was too afraid of what might happen if I did. Why couldn't I shake this feeling? Why couldn't I just let it go? This wasn't supposed to happen. It had been an ordinary day, nothing remarkable, when it all began. I was walking through the parking lot, my thoughts occupied with the usual mundane worries. Suddenly I collided with Greg. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to make me stumble back a few steps, leaving me unsure how to recover from the awkwardness. My keys slipped from my hand, skittering across the pavement before landing a few feet away. Muttering a soft curse under my breath, I bent down to retrieve them. And then it happened. As I reached for the keys, Greg bent down at the same moment. Our hands brushed briefly, but in that fleeting second, something changed. A spark shot through my fingers, traveling up my arm like an electric jolt. Without thinking, I looked up, and our eyes locked. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. There was an unfamiliar tension in the air, one I hadn't anticipated but couldn't deny. It wasn't just a simple touch. There was something more, an unspoken connection neither of us could acknowledge. His gaze lingered on mine just a little too long, revealing a flicker of something I didn't understand but felt deeply. We both withdrew our hands quickly, as though the touch had been too much. The silence that followed was charged in a way I hadn't expected. I forced a smile, pretending it meant nothing, but inside, my heart raced. Why had such a brief moment left me feeling this way? And I couldn't help but wonder, had Greg felt it too? It was one of those frigid nights when the cold seemed to cling to your skin, creeping into your thoughts. The power went out unexpectedly, plunging the house into an eerie quiet. I assumed it would just be a minor inconvenience, but the stillness felt heavier, almost suffocating. Greg and I were in the living room, suddenly enveloped by the silence of the darkened house. There was something strangely intimate about the lack of light and sound. Without the usual background noise, every little detail became more noticeable. The faint rustle of fabric, the sound of our breathing. We both reached for the same blanket at the same time. I let out a soft laugh, tugging at the fabric. "Looks like we're sharing this," he said, his voice low and warm. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was no reason to feel nervous. It was just a blanket, just the two of us sitting together in the cold. But when he sat down beside me, pulling the blanket over us, the air between us grew dense in a way I couldn't ignore. We sat close, not because we had to, but because there wasn't anywhere else to go. The flickering candlelight illuminated his face, making him seem closer, more real, as if nothing could be hidden in the shadows. I glanced at him, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't look away. His eyes met mine, and the silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken thoughts. I didn't want to break it, didn't want to shatter the fragile moment that seemed to carry so much meaning. "What do you think about when you're alone like this?" Greg's voice cut through the quiet. It was calm and casual, but there was a depth to his tone I couldn't quite understand. I hesitated, unsure if I should let him into my thoughts, but something about the atmosphere, the closeness between us, made it feel okay to share. "I think about things I never say out loud," I admitted softly. "Things that feel too complicated. I think about the future, what it holds, and what could be." I hadn't meant to say so much, but once the words were out, I couldn't take them back. Greg stayed quiet for a moment, then shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing against mine. "What if the future turns out differently than we expect?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. The room suddenly felt smaller, as though it contained only the two of us. I looked at him again, and for the first time, the space between us felt less like a gap and more like a bridge, something that brought us closer in ways I couldn't fully understand. There were no more distractions, no more running from the feelings I had buried. In that moment, I realized how much I was allowing myself to feel. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. It was late, and the house had settled into a strange, unnatural quiet, the kind of stillness that only exists when everyone else is asleep, leaving you alone with your thoughts. I had been in the kitchen for a while, mindlessly cleaning the counters, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind wandered elsewhere. It was always the same whenever Greg was near. His presence seemed to draw me out of my world, making everything around me feel sharper, more vivid, yet filled with uncertainty. I hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly he was there, standing close beside me. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence between us was thick, almost oppressive, pressing down on me. Every small motion, every breath I took felt amplified, and I wasn't sure if he was waiting for me to say something or if he too didn't know how to break the stillness. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity, the space separating us shrinking with each passing second. It was impossible to ignore how aligned our bodies were, how close we had become. I could feel his presence more than I could see it, which somehow made it worse. My heartbeat quickened, the sound of it pounding in my ears as I tried to resist the urge to step back, to put some distance between us. But I didn't move, and then, without warning, he leaned in. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then his lips were on mine, warm, soft, and consuming. Everything else seemed to disappear in an instant. There was no space for hesitation, no room for doubt. Only the kiss, and the way it seemed to unleash everything that had been building up for days, weeks, even months. It was a release of pressure, a culmination of emotions that had nowhere else to go. But as abruptly as it began, it ended. We pulled away, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't think clearly. My heart raced, my breathing was shallow, and all I could think was, what had we just done? What had I allowed to happen? In what felt like a blur, I turned back toward the kitchen sink, but then I heard his footsteps. In a split second, he wrapped his arms tightly around me from behind, pulling me against his chest. I could feel his breath on my neck, the heat of his body against mine. And I froze. My thoughts raced as I turned to face him, and before I could stop myself, I kissed him again, harder, more passionately than before. Time seemed to stretch as we stayed locked in that moment, the intensity growing until it was all I could feel. He led me to the bed, moving quickly as he removed his shirt, revealing his muscular chest and firm abs. I followed, shedding my own clothes, exposing myself completely. That was when I saw it, what my mom had been enjoying all this time. He was larger than I had imagined, and as I opened myself to him, he guided himself into me. I clung to his face, pulling him closer as he pushed inside. The sensation was overwhelming, an unfamiliar mix of pleasure and pain. My legs trembled and my toes curled as I let out a scream I couldn't hold back. He didn't pause, didn't hesitate, going deeper as I clung to the moment, feeling every inch of it. When it was over, I was too weak to stand. My body felt drained, and I didn't even know when I had fallen asleep. The next morning, I sat at my desk with my journal open in front of me, but the words wouldn't come. My hands hovered above the page, trembling as my mind replayed the events of the night before. The weight of it all pressed down on me. The kiss, the intimacy, how natural it had felt despite how wrong it was. For fleeting moments, I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened, that I hadn't let it happen. But deep down, I knew the truth, and it gnawed at me like a relentless ache. The guilt was suffocating, an ever-present shadow that clouded my thoughts. I stared at the blank page, unable to write anything. I knew that whatever words I put down would be stained by the shame that consumed me. How had I allowed myself to fall into something so forbidden? It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that had led up to it. The stolen glances, the unspoken moments, the growing tension I had refused to acknowledge. I hadn't meant for it to happen, but it had, and now there was no undoing it. Just then, Greg entered the room, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. My heart raced as I looked up at him, unable to find the words to speak. He stood there for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts before saying quietly, "We need to talk." His words hung in the air, thick with tension. He sat down beside me, and for the longest time, neither of us said anything. The silence felt unbearable, as if we were both afraid to address the enormity of what had happened. Finally, he broke the stillness. "I don't know what happened last night," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know it can't happen again." His words settled heavily in my chest. I nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I feel the same, I whispered. It shouldn't have happened. It was a mistake. We sat there, the unspoken words lingering between us like a fragile thread. Neither of us wanted to admit how much the night had changed everything, but we couldn't ignore it anymore. I don't want this to tear us apart, he said finally, his voice firm but filled with emotion. We have to move on, for the sake of our family. I nodded again, more to reassure myself than him. You're right, I said, the words heavy as they left my lips. We can't let this destroy what we've built. I don't want to lose everything.